All right. Let's go ahead and begin. All right. When we talk about the endocrine system, we're talking about actually, it's two things. We're talking about endocrine glands, and we're talking about the hormones that they secrete. All right. On this slide is a list of all of the endocrine glands that are in your body, most of the endocrine glands that are in your body. Of course, we do remember, if you look at the bottom of that list, that the heart secretes certain endocrine hormones. The kidneys secrete hormones. So not all, kind of like lymph tissue is not just lymph nodes and spleen. You'll find it in other areas. You'll find endocrine secreting cells in other areas of the body. What's the hormone secreted by the heart that we talked about? Give you a hint. It's from the atria. ANP, BNP. Okay. What about the kidneys? There's two. Renin. What else? No, that's renin. Nope. That affects the kidney, but it's not secreted by the kidney. Erythropoietin. Oh, yeah. Okay, so we're going to focus more on the endocrine glands rather than the specific organs that act as endocrine glands sometimes going forward. All right. How do we control endocrine secretion? How do we control hormones that are secreted? Well, one big concept you have to be familiar with is something called tropic hormones. All right, I know it's tropic, and it makes me think of going to Florida and sitting on the beach and like forgetting that Ohio exists. But tropic hormones, by definition, are hormones that cause the release of other hormones. If you know what the tropic hormones are, you know what they do. They cause the release of specific hormones. All right. Tropic hormones. All of the hormones in the hypothalamus are tropic. Most of the hormones in the anterior pituitary are tropic. All right. So, if most are tropic in the hypothalamus and most are tropic in the anterior pituitary, we're not going to go over many hormones in those two areas, because I'm not going to take time to go over tropic hormones. All right. Endocrine glands can also respond to changes in the environment. So if sodium levels get too low or sodium levels get too high, calcium levels get too low, calcium levels get too high, endocrine gland sugar levels get too low, sugar levels get too high. Endocrine glands detect this and secrete the hormone to correct it. All right. So if your sugar is too low and you release a hormone to correct it, what's that going to do to sugar? Bring it up. Okay. So one of the more difficult things that people have with hormones is that things go up and things go down. All right, and you have to consider both sides of that equation. All right, and we'll talk about this as we go further into the lecture. All right, also the nervous system can directly stimulate glands to secrete hormones, and a big place that we'll see that is in the posterior pituitary. By the way, how is genetics? Good?
He's entertaining. You like him?
He is. He's loud as fuck, too. Good. I thought of him because and I just didn't feel like switching it back. He's got this screen extended, so I'm looking here, and my slide's not advancing, but it is over here.
IT is definitely his forte.
What do what?
IT is definitely his forte.
Like everybody else in this program. It's me. It's me. This is a summary slide. It's been a long day, and it's only 1 o'clock. a summary of what we just talked about. So a humoral stimulus is changing levels of substances in the blood, like that's the calcium or the sodium changing or the glucose changing. The neural stimulus is directly from a neuron, and hormonal stimulus, this would be the tropic. Okay, so they're in a different order than we covered on the previous slide, but all that information is still right here, just showing you in graphics what they kind of look like. All right, so that takes us into types of secretion. All right, if it's endocrine secretion, crine means secretion. What does endo mean? Inside. So endocrine secretion secretes biochemicals, hormones, into the blood, and then it travels through the blood and gets to its target cell, which could be relatively close or could be like from your brain to your little toe. Okay? But it travels through the bloodstream. That's endocrine. If it's exocrine secretion, that means it's secreting into a tube or a duct or a surface. All right? What are some examples of exocrine secretion? Sweating. Good. What about pancreatic enzymes going into the duodenum? Would that be exocrine? Absolutely. What about bile secretion from the liver? Excuse me, exocrine. Okay, all those are exocrine. So definitely know the difference between those two. What we're going to be talking about mostly is endocrine. All right. So this top picture shows you endocrine secretion. We also have neuroendocrine secretion, where the neuron doesn't release neurotransmitters into a synaptic cleft. It releases neurotransmitters directly into the bloodstream. That's what we call neuroendocrine secretion. And again, an example of this would be in the posterior pituitary. And we'll talk about that specific example once we get there. Paracrine secretion would be where you have a cell that secretes a hormone that goes into the interstitial fluid and only affects nearby tissues. All right, it only affects nearby tissues. That would be an example of inflammatory chemicals affecting the endothelial cells and precapillary sphincters, causing inflammation. Autocrine, auto means self, so it would be a cell secreting a substance that goes and acts back on itself. Where did we see that happen? There's one place. One place where that really happens a lot. Pardon? Actually, yes. It can happen in a female reproductive. Where else can it happen? This is the example I always use. T helper cell secretes chemicals that go back and activate that T helper cell. Okay, that would be another example. All right. Most of what we're going to talk about is in this first two categories, endocrine and neuroendocrine. But be aware of what paracrine and autocrine secretion are. All right. Whenever we talk about endocrine, we always have to compare it to the nervous system. The nervous system can communicate. Something in the brain can communicate with my little toe through the nervous system. But something in my brain can communicate with my little toe through the endocrine system too. So what's the difference between them? All right. The difference between them is with the nervous system, you have a direct connection, a wire going from your brain all the way down to your toe. And that's releasing neurotransmitters telling your toe to contract or whatever. Whereas hormones, or the endocrine system, they'll secrete something from the brain, it'll go into your bloodstream, and eventually it'll get down to your little toe. Both got down to your little toe. One is a direct route through a direct wired connection. The other is actually this would be like your Ethernet connection. This would be your Wi-Fi. Both get you onto the internet, but they do it different ways, right? All right, now, hormones get into the blood. They go to virtually every cell of the body, But is every cell of the body affected by the hormone? No. So what makes a particular cell respond to a hormone? It's got to have a receptor for that hormone. If you don't have receptors, you're not going to respond. Okay? What do hormones do when they encounter a receptor? Bind. Right? So the hormone will bind. All right? And when it binds to the receptor, it initiates some kind of change to happen within the cell that has that receptor. All right, so the hormone binds to a receptor. Receptor initiates a change in that cell. The more receptors a particular cell has, the greater the response is going to be. So instead of like we saw with neurons sending signals, where to get a response to happen much more like muscle contraction more strongly, you send many more action potentials. Here, it requires you to have many more receptors to have a response in the target cell. All right, so that's another term to know. The cells that have the receptor for the hormone are called the target cells for that hormone. All right, so when we start talking about target cells, know what that means. So I could ask you in a test situation, what's the target cell for ADH? Or where is the target cell for ADH? And you would say kidney. All right, a little bit about the chemistry. You have two general classes of hormones. Really easy. Steroid and non-steroid. All right? Steroids are based on the molecule cholesterol. In fact, all steroids in your body are derived from cholesterol. So, cholesterol is actually a necessary thing in your body because it helps us to produce these really important hormones. I'm going to make this, I'm not going to make this easy on you. It's already easy on you. There's only a couple places that secrete steroid hormones. If you know those, then everything else is non-steroid. Okay? If you know these, everything else is non-steroid. Most of your steroid hormones are going to come from your adrenal cortex. There's one that's missing here. There's cortisol, aldosterone, and androgens. All right, androgens or androgenic hormones are those that can be converted into estrogens or testosterone through different pathways and different enzymes that are available. So most of your steroid hormones are going to come from the adrenal cortex. We're not even going to consider the kidney, so don't even worry about that. The other ones are going to come from your testes and ovaries, and we've already seen that in the reproductive chapter, right? Estrogens, progesterone, testosterone. So these are the only places you're going to see steroid hormones. So in the thyroid, do you have steroid hormones? No. In the pancreas, do you have steroid hormones? In the pituitary, do we have steroid hormones? No. Okay? So if it's not in the adrenal gland or the gonads, it's not a steroid hormone. Right. Did I say that right? Yes. All right. If they're derived from cholesterol, and cholesterol is a lipid, that makes steroid hormones lipid soluble. What are cell membranes made out of? Lipids. So, what would happen to a hormone that comes in a steroid hormone that comes in contact with the cell membrane? Goes right through. All right? So it goes right through. Steroid hormone, lipid bilayer, goes right through. Therefore, if it goes right through the cell membrane, the receptor for steroid hormones is either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus. And if it's in the cytoplasm, it's going to move to the nucleus after a steroid hormone binds. All right, so steroid hormone receptors inside the cell. Okay, in the example here, we have the steroid It's binding to its receptor, and then it moves to the nucleus. Generally speaking, when a steroid binds to its receptor, it becomes a transcription factor. All right, what do transcription factors do? They help make, begins with an M, rhymes with mRNA. mRNA. That was really bad. Okay, so what that means is if you're producing new mRNA, what does mRNA go to make? Proteins. And then that protein is going to cause a change in the cell. If you're going from 0 to making a bunch of mRNA to making a bunch of protein, that takes time. All right? So steroid hormones take a long time, relatively speaking, to have an effect. But how long do their effects last? Long time. They take long to act, but their effects are for long term. All right, so knowledge check. Cortisol, where's its receptor? Inside. I guess we didn't go over that. It was on the previous slide. Cortisol, from the adrenal cortex. Where's its receptor? Inside the cell, right? Aldosterone. In fact, even if you look at the names of steroid hormones, they usually end in ol, O-L, or O-N-E. Okay, that's a good indicator too. Cortisol, aldosterone, progesterone, testosterone. Estrogen is just a mess up. But estradiol, that's a form of estrogen. All right, so own or all will tell you if it's a steroid hormone too. And all steroid hormones are secreted by, most of them, adrenal cortex. That's important to remember, adrenal cortex, because you also have an adrenal medulla, and there's no steroid hormones there. All right. It's such a headache. Non-steroid hormones, by definition, are not lipids. All right, so if you're not lipid soluble, the only other option is your water soluble. Okay, so do non-steroid hormones just diffuse right through the cell membrane? No. All right, so where would their receptor be then? If they can't go directly through the cell membrane, their receptor has to be on the surface, right? It has to be on the surface of the cell. All right, your non-steroids typically divided into 3 categories, and all are related to proteins. You have your amines, which are derived from amino acids, typically tyrosine. Your peptides are what? Short chains of amino acids. Or your protein hormones, which are long chains of amino acids. All right, so your non-steroid hormones are going to be basically amino acid based, whether they're single, small chains, or long chains. Okay, all are water soluble, so that means their receptors on the surface of the cell. Where won't you find non-steroid hormones? Adrenal cortex. Where else? Ovaries. Testes. Good. All right. Most of your non-steroid hormones, if they're an amine, are derived from tyrosine. All right, and this is your amino acid tyrosine right here. I don't give a flying fuck if you know the structure. Okay? I'm just showing you this to prove a point. If you have tyrosine, there are enzymes that convert tyrosine to DOPA, more specifically L-DOPA. All right. From there, another enzyme can convert it to dopamine. Dopamine, we know, is a neurotransmitter. Okay. Basal nuclei, remember, secrete dopamine. All right. Dopamine, with another enzyme, can then be converted into norepinephrine, and you add another enzyme to that. Norepinephrine can be converted to epinephrine. All right. So from tyrosine, you can get 2 hormones, 3 hormones, and 2 neurotransmitters. All right, all from that one molecule, depending on if the enzyme is present in the cells to make that. Okay? So that is how you would synthesize down this pathway. The other tyrosine-derived hormone are your thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Big difference between T3 and T4 and all of your catecholamines. All right, catecholamines. Catechol just refers to the ring structure. Amine refers to the fact that it has a nitrogen group on it. So that's why they're called catecholamines. Big difference between these two. All your catecholamines are water soluble. T3 and T4, they're actually lipid soluble. All right, and that's a fundamental difference that you're going to see. It's not a steroid, but they're not water soluble. So T3 and T4 is an exception to the rule. All right, this is just saying the same thing I've already said, this slide. If you are a lipid-soluble protein, if you are lipid-soluble, whether you're a steroid hormone or whether you're T3 or T4, you don't dissolve in water. So generally speaking, you have to have a plasma protein to transport you around the blood. All right, so usually you'll see thyroid hormones and steroid hormones bound to some kind of plasma protein to help transport it. All right, we've already talked about this. Non-steroid hormones, they're receptors on the surface of the cells. So that's going to be your typical signal transduction pathway. You bind to a receptor, you have all kinds of changes occur in the cell, and that cell does something. All right, everything that you need for non-steroid hormones to have an effect is already in the cell. It just has to be activated. So what does that say about the time course of non-steroid hormones when it binds? Very fast. So they're very short time course. That also means that they don't last very long either. So non-steroid hormones, short time course to have an effect, but their effects don't last very long. That's why often, like in a stress response, for example, you'll see epinephrine and norepinephrine released. Those will have short-term effects to help you deal with a stressful event, but you also have cortisol released to help you deal with the long-term consequences of that stressful event. Okay? So, typically, since non-steroid hormones cannot get into the cell and they bind to a receptor, they rely on second messengers inside the cell to have that effect. And one of the more common second messengers is your cyclic AMP, or CAMP. All right? That's not the only one. In fact, there's a couple dozen other kind, but that's the more common one. All right? What cyclic AMP does is it activates kinases. Do you guys remember what kinases do? They put phosphates on things. And usually when you put phosphates on things, you activate. There's some cases where that actually inhibits, but most cases you put a phosphate, it activates it. That's like the on switch. All right? And then you start a signal cascade that causes a rapid sequence of events that occurs in a short time course. All right? How does this work? Typically, we're going back to this. You guys have seen this before. This should be not news. You have a hormone bind to a G protein. Shit, not these again. All right. G protein, I don't care about the molecular biology of it. We'll go and activate something called adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase will convert ATP into cyclic AMP. And then cyclic AMP will then go and activate kinases, which then will then phosphorylate a bunch of crap. Okay, where have we seen this before? Remember rods and cones? They have a, I think that was cyclic GMP. Remember the smell pathway? That was cyclic AMP based as well. Okay, this is no different. The only difference is it's a hormone activating it instead of a neural pathway or some kind of sensory signal. All right, are we good to now? Sweet. Is most of this like complete review? Yeah. Good to know though, right? No. Do you have to know it for a test? Yes. When second messengers activate things inside the cell, this is a short list of things they'll do. So, remember, with non-steroid proteins, you're relying on second messengers to cause a change inside the cell. Sometimes those second messengers will put more ion channels onto the surface of the cell. That will increase the permeability of that cell to that particular ion. Does that make sense? Or another example is insulin, for example, when it binds to its receptor, it'll cause changes that put more glucose receptors on the surface. So you can take more glucose in. The cells will become more permeable to glucose. All right? You could activate enzymes to go down a number of different pathways. Protein synthesis, things like that. Okay? So, you're activating things. Happens pretty quickly. Usually, also what happens very quickly is cyclic AMP gets converted back to AMP, so you break a ring, and it's AMP now, and that deactivates the second messenger. All right? The funny thing is, if you guys remember back to molecular biology, almost as soon as you make cyclic AMP, phosphodiesterase converts it to AMP. So it shuts off really quickly. What's the benefit of that? You prevent overstimulation, right? You prevent overstimulation. I don't think it's in here. Let me go forward a few slides. Oh, there it is. Never mind. All right. Up there, you see a list of hormones that use cyclic AMP. I'm actually not going to test you on that. I don't care if you know the hormones that use cyclic AMP. But if you're a hormone that uses cyclic AMP, by definition, that means you're what kind of hormone? Non-steroid. If I have to talk, you guys have to talk too. All right. So, like I said, other second messengers include cyclic GMP, which we talked about. Diacylglycerol is another one. Phosphatidylinositol, IP3, things like that. Again, I don't care that you know those. Just be aware that cyclic AMP is not the only second messenger. But it is an important one. All right. The more receptors a cell has for a hormone, what does that do for the cell? That was like 10 slides back.
Greater response.
Greater response. More receptors mean greater response. But sometimes hormones are secreted in very small concentrations. You guys have taken anatomy. You have seen how big the pituitary gland is and how big the pineal gland is. And when it secretes hormones, that's got to go through your entire body. So what do you think the hormone concentration in all of that 6 liters of blood is going to be like? Very low. If it were salt, you wouldn't taste it. Okay? So, despite the fact that target cell, our hormones are secreted in very small amounts compared to the overall volume of blood, they can stimulate big effects in the cell. One way is that cells will have multiple receptors. The other way is that once a hormone binds to its receptor, you have this amplification going on. So one hormone binds to one receptor. You activate, let's say, 5 G proteins. Each one of those G proteins activates an adenylate, let's say 2 adenylate cyclase. So now you have 10 going through. Each adenylate cyclase produces 100 cyclic AMP. So now you've gone from 10 to 10 times 100, 1,000, right? Each one of those cyclic AMPs may activate 2 kinases. So what you see is the signal getting bigger and bigger and bigger in the cell. You're activating more and more. We call that amplification, all right? One hormone binding to a receptor can have a big response in the cell because you're activating multiple things. It's a chain reaction. That doesn't happen with steroid hormones. Okay? That does not happen with steroid hormones. All right. Negative feedback is the general way in which hormone concentrations in the blood are controlled. Bless you. All right. What is negative feedback? Allison, you suck. That was the worst exam I've ever seen, and you should just drop out of PA school. That's not the negative feedback I'm talking about. I'm just kidding, by the way. That's for asking me all those questions. Just kidding. Ask me questions. I love it when you guys ask questions. So negative feedback. If you were to measure hormone concentration throughout the day, you'd find at some points it's low, at some points it's high. But if you average out all the high and low points throughout the day, you have an average hormone concentration. So what that says is that when hormone concentrations get too low, you're going to secrete more hormone. If they get too high, you're going to secrete less hormone. You get too low, more hormone. Secrete too high, less hormone. All right, so it's going to go up and down. Most of your hormones act in a very cyclical fashion. You remember we saw that with luteinizing hormone, with female reproductive cycles. All right, so again, negative feedback. If something's too high, you reverse it. If something's too low, you reverse it. All right, and you shut the pathway down. So, again, this is that bidirectional thing. If something gets too high or too low, you need to do something to switch it around. So, let's do a quick example. If hormone level gets too high, that's going to go to bind to a receptor. That's going to sense a change. It's going to go to a control center. Remember, negative feedback receptor control center or regulator. We'll say, hey, that's too high. We got to bring it down. It'll tell the effectors to stop releasing hormones, and then hormone levels go down. Okay? When hormone levels go down, what happens to this pathway? It gets shut down. Okay? Because you've decreased hormone levels, you don't need to keep decreasing hormone levels. That's part of the negative feedback. All right? But then if hormone levels get too low, you want to increase them. Once they're at a level where you want them to be, you shut down this pathway too. Okay? That's the basis of negative feedback. I'm not going to go through all the ins and outs of it because by now you guys should have an understanding of it. But we also have this concept of positive feedback. Allison, you are improving so much in this program, I think you're going to graduate top of the class. Not that kind of positive feedback. Positive feedback means you have a continuous cycle that's making something, for example, if your positive feedback loop results in increasing hormones, you're going to keep increasing those hormones higher and higher and higher and higher without the ability to shut it down. Okay? That's what positive feedback is. You remember our HPG axis from reproductive, where the hypothalamus secreted gonadotropin releasing hormone, causing anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH. FSH and LH. What would we call GnRH if it causes the release of FSH? What type of hormone is it? Tropic. What would we call LH if it causes the release of estrogen and testosterone? Tropic. But does FSH and LH always act as a tropic hormone? No, because they can do other things too. So some tropic hormones can also perform other functions as well. All right? Then the ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. And remember, at a certain point in the female reproductive cycle, estrogens can go back and say, hey, anterior pituitary, release more tropic hormones so that we can produce more of these steroids. All right? But then at other parts of the cycle, they can go back and negatively feedback. So, the female reproductive cycle is an example of positive feedback, tropic hormones acting as tropic hormones and non-tropic hormones, and negative feedback. What's another example of positive feedback? We've talked about 2 this semester. Besides this. Pardon? The birth cycle, right? You stretch the cervix. That sends signals up to the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin says we're going to contract the uterus, push the baby down, stretches more, signals more oxytocin, pushing, stretching until the baby's born. Okay? That's what we mean by positive feedback. What's the other example? Once you've... Blood clotting. Thank you. Sweet. I love you, Mark. Blood clotting. Once you form thrombin, that can cause the formation of more thrombin. All right. So, good. So, aside from this negative feedback and positive feedback, hormone concentration is kind of a balance between secreting the hormone and clearing it from your blood. Sometimes that clearing could happen when it binds to a receptor. Sometimes that clearing happens by the liver. Okay? Sometimes it happens in the kidneys where we get rid of it in the urine. So if a hormone is filtered by the glomerulus, we're going to pee it out. Okay? That's how we get rid of it. Sometimes they're just destroyed at their target cell. All right? So this is talking about the mechanisms of clearance right here. All right. Some general effects of hormones on certain other systems of your body. So hormones and bone. Growth hormone. We haven't gone over it yet, but does anybody know where it's secreted from?
Pituitary.
Which one? Anterior pituitary. Okay. Growth hormone stimulates cartilage to divide at the epiphyseal plate. Remember that epiphyseal plate, also known as the growth plate, is where long bone growth occurs. All right? And it works because the epiphyseal plate is cartilage. And if that cartilage divides, it pushes older cartilage away from the center line. What happens to that older cartilage then? It becomes bone, and the bone grows. All right, so if we have growth hormone telling us to secrete cartilage cells to divide, that's pushing this growth plate and causing long bone growth. All right, so that's the mechanism behind how kids grow. If we have insufficient growth hormone, in other words, if we have insufficient growth hormone, particularly before puberty, we end up with dwarfism. So if we don't have enough growth hormone, we don't have enough cartilage being produced, the long bones don't grow as big. People are tiny, right? Like hobbits. Not like hobbits, but you know what I mean. If we have excessive growth hormone, this is interesting. If you have excessive growth hormone before puberty, that means you're causing cartilage cells just to divide wildly. What's going to happen to long bone growth? Really quick. And what's the person going to look like? Really tall. Okay, really tall. Says nothing about their bone strength, but they're going to get really tall before puberty. What happens after puberty to your growth plate, to your epiphyseal plate? It seals. It stops, and you're not growing anymore. But if you're still secreting a large amount of growth hormone, then it's going to start causing bone and soft tissue to get thicker. And we call that acromegaly. The best example I can give you, if you've ever, I know most of you are pretty young relative to me, Andre the Giant. Big example. How tall was he? I think he was like 8 foot, wasn't he? And he was gigantic. So growth hormone before puberty made him really tall. Growth hormone after puberty made his face like that big, kind of like, made him big, basically. All right? So that's what can happen with growth hormone if it's too little or too much. Thyroid hormone can also have an effect on the bones. What does thyroid hormone do? It increases your basal metabolic rate. All right? So that means your cartilage cells are going to be more active. If you don't have enough thyroid hormone, that can delay bone growth. So if you have a child that's born with hypothyroidism, some problems with their thyroid, get them on Synthroid really quickly so that they don't end up being really short. Does that make sense? All right. On the other end, sex steroids also have a profound effect on bone as well. Sex steroids, they do promote the formation of bone. All right. Testosterone is a much stronger stimulus than estrogen is. All right. Testosterone is so boys will grow taller faster, right, because of testosterone. But estrogen affects the epiphyseal plate much more quickly. What that means is girls' epiphyseal plate will close sooner than boys. So they have less stimulus for bone growth, and the epiphyseal plate closes earlier. What's the consequence of that? Girls are generally shorter, okay, because of this. All right, other hormones in bone. Calcitonin and parathyroid. I think we've talked about this before, haven't we? Where I said a student told me that calcitonin helps keep your bone in. Okay, thanks for the eye roll. But you remember it. Okay, so the way this works, if you have low blood calcium, parathyroid glands will detect that, release parathyroid hormone that will raise blood calcium. If you have high blood calcium, that'll stimulate calcitonin to deposit calcium into bone. If it's going into bone, it's coming out of the blood, and that will decrease your blood calcium. All right? The way this works is that parathyroid hormone increases the activity of osteoclasts. What do osteoclasts do? Break down bone or resorb bone. If you're breaking down bone, you're freeing calcium to go into the blood. That's how they raise blood calcium, from the bone. Calcitonin activates osteoblasts. What do osteoblasts do? Build bone. So you're taking calcium from the blood and building more bone because you're activating osteoblasts. All right, question for you though. If you're calcitonin and you're activating osteoblasts to take calcium from the blood and build more bone, are you also inhibiting osteoclasts? Probably. Okay, so activation effects on one type of cell, inhibiting effects on the opposite type of cell. All right, this I'm not going to spend any time on because much time on because we've already talked about it. The pineal gland. Where's that located? Back here, right in your brain. All right, and what did we say it is involved with? Circadian rhythms, right? Our ability to sleep when it's night, wake when it's light. All right, so it's our internal clock. And it does so by producing this hormone melatonin. All right, we talked about how that works. There is newer evidence that suggests that melatonin may inhibit gonadotropins. Where are gonadotropins coming from? Tropic hormone, gonad, to the gonads. Use the words. Where are gonadotropins coming from? Pardon? No. They're affecting the ovaries. So where do they come from? Remember the HPG? So the pituitary, right? So what are the two gonadotropins from the pituitary? LH and FSH. Good. So you're inhibiting LH and FSH. They think that, or there's evidence in animals, that you are inhibiting gonadotropins during the winter, right? More dark means more melatonin. You inhibit gonadotropins. And then when it starts getting light out, less melatonin, less inhibition in the spring. What do animals like to do in the spring? Yeah, get busy. This might be the reason why. All right. Another thing about the pineal gland is that given its location right here, just behind the cerebral aqueduct of Sylvia, sweet. If you get a tumor growing here and you compress that cerebral aqueduct, what's going to happen to CSF flow? It's going to stop. And if CSF flow is building up in your third ventricle and your lateral ventricles, and your fontanelles have not closed yet, what's going to happen? Hydrocephalus. All right, so that's going to cause the accumulation of CSF. If your fontanelles have closed and you are, let's say, a child of 12 and this happens, what would that do? Would that make your head bigger? No, these sutures they're sewn shut. Pardon? Shift what? It would shift, it would cause brain shifts, right? It would squish the brain up against the skull, and that can cause all sorts of problems. Okay? If things go wrong with the pineal gland, we can have circadian rhythm disorders. Delayed sleep phase disorder is one of them, which means that you go to bed a couple of hours later than dark time, and you wake up later. Okay? Is that always a disorder? No, some people are naturally night people and morning people. This may be, like if you're a night person, you may have this. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a problem. Okay? If it becomes a problem, that's when we call it a disorder. Okay? Advanced sleep phase disorder, what do you think that is? Morning person! Me! My wife was like, why the fuck are you so happy in the morning? Like, because it's great. Jet lag can affect circadian rhythms because you're crossing time zones. And if you go from here to California, that's a 3-hour difference, right? So that's 3 hours of missing daylight that you're going to have, or 3 hours of missing night you have, and your sleep gets off, so that clock has to reset itself. And shift work disorders. I don't know. I've worked one night shift. I've worked one night shift at my nursing job. Pardon?
You've only worked one.
Only one.
I've not recovered from it. Did it for 3 years.
Really?
Still, that's why I can't go to bed at a normal hour. It's awful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I tried, so I knew I had the shift coming. I tried to sleep before I went to the shift. Couldn't. So I went to bed. I was awake for nearly 24 hours because I couldn't sleep before and I couldn't sleep after. Do what? But your brain knows.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Why don't we take a short break and then we'll continue on with the HP axis. Recording every move you make. I'm watching you. All right. HP axis. H stands for what? Hypothalamus. P stands for pituitary. Specifically, the HP axis is hypothalamus anterior pituitary. All right. So the HP axis always comes in threes. All right. So there's a third one. If it's the HPT axis. Damn it. If it's the HPT axis, it's the hypothalamus pituitary thyroid. If it's the HPA axis, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal. If it's the HPG axis, those are the gonads. Okay? So, the way this works, and I will use an actual hormone, hypothalamus will release CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone. All right, use these, break down the words. The words matter. I say that a lot. Words matter. Corticotropin, tropic hormone for the cortex. What's the only cortex we've talked about? Adrenal cortex. So corticotropin releasing hormone tells the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, adrenocorticating corticotropic hormone. Which will then go to where? The adrenal gland, and cause one of the layers of the adrenal cortex to release cortisol. Okay? Cortisol, when it gets high enough, can go back and shut off ACTH release. It can also go back and shut off CRH release from the hypothalamus. So that is what we call a, what kind of loop? Negative feedback loop. All right? ACTH can go back and shut off CRH if ACTH gets too high. So we have multiple levels of control typically within these HP axes. Okay, they can always go back and shut off the release of the tropic hormones, thus shutting down the pathway. All right, so that's generally how they work. Tag, you're it. All right, now we're going to start talking about specific hormone, endocrine glands. All right, starting with the pituitary. All right, the pituitary gland sits just below what? The hypothalamus. Shout it out. Don't be scared. Don't be scared. There's two portions, and I see a lot of people say, it looks like a ball sack. I've always thought that too. I'm like, anyway. All right, there's the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. It's kind of hard to see here. This is the anterior, this is the posterior. How do we know in a stain? The anterior stains very dark because it's full of cells that secrete hormones. The posterior doesn't stain very dark because most of the tissue are axons coming from the hypothalamus. All right, what's going to stain darker? A bunch of axons or a tissue packed full of cells? The tissue packed full of cells. So you can actually see the difference between them. All right, anterior lobe, also known as the adenohypophysis. Remember the hypophyseal fossa within the skull? No. We have to, it's right in the sella turcica. All right. These are the hormones that these are the hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary. All right. ACTH is tropic. TSH is tropic. FSH and LH are sometimes tropic. Prolactin and growth hormone are not tropic at all. Anybody know what TSH stands for? Thyroid stimulating hormone. Okay, good. All right. These are all regulated by hypothalamic hormones. And we'll show that in a different slide. All right. The posterior pituitary does not produce its own hormones. They're actually produced up here in the hypothalamus. All right. And what happens, let's assume this is a neuron. So the proteins are made in the cell body of that neuron. They travel down the axon. You guys ever seen those videos where proteins in the cell are carrying vesicles and they're literally walking on microtubules? It's a really neat video. I put that video out on Canvas for you guys to watch if you haven't seen it before. But that's what we call slow transport down to the axon terminal here. And then when this gets signaled, an action potential will get sent. You release the hormones and they go into the bloodstream. This is an example of that neuroendocrine secretion. looks like we're playing hangman. Okay. So, anterior pituitary connected to the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, it is neural tissue. And all of the hormones secreted from there are neural secretion. So we have these neurons that go to the blood in this stalk, the stalk of the pituitary gland, the infundibulum. Okay? And there's blood vessels there. You have the superior hypophyseal artery. You don't have to know that. That goes in. Hypothalamic hormones go into there. Then you have this portal system. What's a portal system? You go to another capillary before you go back to the heart. So there's this portal system in the anterior pituitary where hormones from the hypothalamus will go to the anterior pituitary, cause release of those hormones, and those will come out the vein and then head out into circulation. Okay, so that's how that works. All right, this is a summary slide. On a test situation, I will never give you like PRF and expect you to know what that means. I will give you a name, and then in parentheses, I'll put PRF after it. All right? Again, words matter. Pay attention to the words if you want to know what the hormone's doing. All right? So, for example, growth hormone releasing hormone. What does it do? Causes release of growth hormone, right? Prolactin releasing factor causes the release of prolactin. All right, the names, whoever named these did a really good job, right? It's not Golgi factor. Fucker. Okay. They'll go to the anterior pituitary, cause the release of these hormones, and these all have target organs at the end. So this would be the HP target axis. Okay? So this is a summary slide of everything that's going on. So I'm not going to go over this, but we'll talk about it when we get to specific hormones. All right. If you take a cell out of the anterior pituitary and look at it, and then compare it to another cell from the anterior pituitary, it's probably going to look different. What that means is there are groups of cells in the anterior pituitary that secrete specific hormones. So that doesn't mean that every cell is going to secrete all hormones. There are specific cells that are designed to secrete the specific hormone. All right? So if they are somatotropes, what does somato mean? Body. Somatotropes release growth hormone. Where does growth hormone have its effects? On the body. Okay? So that's why it's named that way. Another name for it is somatotropin. Corticotropes secrete adrenocorticotropin. Thyrotropes secrete thyroid-stimulating hormone. So the cells are named according to the hormones they secrete as well. But again, specific cell groups secrete specific hormones. That's the point of this slide. So, for each hormone that I want you to know something about, you'll have a slide like this. Growth hormone. If it has a different name, I'll put it there. Somatotropin. Back up for a second. What would somatotropin mean? You know what tropic means. You know what somato means. That it has some sort of effect on the body. Okay? So, growth hormone. Where is it produced? from somatotropes of the anterior pituitary. I don't care that you know the percentage. It's not important. Where does it act? Peripheral tissues, the body. Okay, so growth hormone, we said it acted on bone, right? But it does act on more than just bone. So liver and peripheral tissues. What is its structure? We could also say, what is growth hormone type? It's a protein hormone, which tells you it is steroid or non-steroid? Non-steroid. If it's a protein hormone, it's not got to be non-steroid. So if it's non-steroid, that means it has to be water soluble. All right, so you'll get this kind of information for the hormones that I actually want you to know something about. It's a protein hormone composed of 191 amino acids. Do I care that it's 191 amino acids? No. All right. What does growth hormone do? In other words, how does it cause growth? Well, if you want to build things inside your body, what are the building blocks for cells? What are the building blocks inside of cells? Amino acids. So, and if you want to build things with amino acids, you have to have what to do that? No. No. Energy. She's going to think twice about sitting there in the future. All right, so what growth hormone does in its target cells is it increases amino acid transport in cells. You need your building blocks. It's going to increase the rate of transcription and translation so that you produce proteins to grow, and it's going to decrease the breakdown of proteins. All right, because if you want to be in an anabolic state, you want to reduce your catabolism. All right. So, as far as energy goes, what's the difference between the energy content of fat versus the energy content of glucose? You guys remember? All right. How about we do this? Which one do you get more energy from? Fats or glucose?
Glucose.
Fats.
Glucose.
You get more energy from fats than you do glucose. Per gram of molecule, you get 2.5 times more energy from fats than you do from glucose. All right? So if you want to be in an anabolic state, you want your energy to come from high energy sources. So that's where you're going to increase the amount of fat coming from adipose tissue going into cells. All right, so growth hormone will go to adipose tissue. So this stupid looking thing right here is adipose tissue. It's going to convert triglycerides into glycerol and fatty acids. Those will go into circulation and go to cells to provide the energy for protein anabolism. But it's also going to inhibit the effects of insulin. What does insulin cause you to do to energy? Store it. All right? So you don't want to store fat energy. You want to release fat energy so you can build. This is why when kids go through these growth spurts and they may have been a little bit heavy, they start to lighten up because they're burning that fat to get into this anabolic state of building proteins. All right. So if you want to preferentially use fats for energy, you want to inhibit carbohydrate use. Because what's our preferred energy source for most cells on a general everyday basis? Carbohydrates, right? But if you want to be in an anabolic state and get more energy, you want to inhibit that carbohydrate use and rely on fats. All right, so you're going to have decreased glucose uptake in muscle, decreased uptake in fat, and increased gluconeogenesis. Okay? That's actually going to increase your insulin, right? If you have low glucose, that's going to increase your insulin. But your cells are going to be insulin resistant, so you're almost in like a diabetic state. But you're growing, you're using fats preferentially, so it's a shift in metabolism rather than a default in metabolism, if that makes sense. All right, so what are some factors that will stimulate the release of growth hormone, and what are some factors that will inhibit the release of growth hormone? All right, on the left would be everything that would stimulate the release of growth hormone. Everything on the right would be that which would inhibit growth hormone. And we've talked about a lot of these. They're related to energy metabolism. But if you look on the right at aging, increased aging inhibits growth hormone release, right? Do we want to be in an anabolic state as adults? No, because what would happen? We would basically grow perpetually. All right, we don't want that to happen. So, evidence for this is if you look at the concentration of growth hormone, I mean, we do need growth hormone. We do need to produce things. Growth hormone helps us to build muscle, for example. So, if you look at a child, concentration of growth hormone is 6 nanograms per milliliter. In the adult, it's 1.5 to 3. So, a quarter to half of the amount in children. All right, saying that it's much more important for children to have growth hormone than us. All right, so that's growth hormone. Easy, right? Really hot. All right, we talked about prolactin when we did reproductive. I'm not going to talk about it here. Okay? So, since every other hormone from the anterior pituitary is tropic, the only one you have to know from the anterior pituitary out of the 6 is growth hormone. You're welcome. I didn't do it, the material did it. So we'll move to the posterior pituitary. Remember, the posterior pituitary is made up of neural tissue. Where are the cell bodies for the neural tissue in the posterior pituitary? Where are the cell bodies for the cells, for the neurons in the posterior pituitary located? Remember? In the hypothalamus. And it's just the axons that are going through the posterior pituitary. So here are your your cell bodies up here in the hypothalamus. They're going to travel down. And remember, the synapses onto the blood are down in the posterior pituitary. So hormones are made in the hypothalamus but secreted by the posterior pituitary because they're neurons. All right, so we refer to the hormones that are secreted as neurohormones. There's only 2. Those are ADH and oxytocin. All right, we are. You may have heard a lot of things about oxytocin, including the fact that it's the snuggle hormone. Have you guys heard of that before? If you have more oxytocin, you're more prone to want to get close to somebody. I am grossly deficient in oxytocin. All right. Again, here's that thing. Antidiuretic hormone. I want you to know this. Antidiuretic hormone are, well, 2 things. 1, antidiuretic. You don't want to pee. So antidiuretic hormone makes you not pee. If you're not peeing, what are you doing? Retaining water. So antidiuretic hormone makes you retain water. All right? The other name for this is vasopressin. What does that mean? It constricts blood vessels. All right? So antidiuretic hormone tells you exactly what it does. And vasopressin also tells you what it does. All right, so antidiuretic hormone actually has two effects. Produced in the hypothalamus, released from the posterior pituitary. Where does it act? Kidneys, that's where the antidiuretic hormone occurs, and blood vessels, that's where the vasoconstriction occurs. What is its structure? It's a peptide hormone, which means it is a non-steroid. Where's its receptor? On the surface. All right, so if it's a peptide hormone, it's got to be water soluble, according to our rules of hormone. An aside, are all proteins water soluble? No, they're not. But when we're talking about hormones here, we are going to consider them all water soluble. All right, so what does antidiuretic hormone do in the kidneys? It causes them to reduce water excretion. In other words, retain water. Where does that happen? Do you guys remember? Where in the nephron does this water retention occur? Where does ADH have its effect specifically? DCT and collecting ducts. Mostly the collecting ducts. All right? Also causes blood vessels to constrict. What's that going to do to blood pressure? Increase blood pressure. So if you're retaining water and you're pressing on your vessels, constriction, both of these are designed to help raise blood pressure. All right. So the trigger for ADH release is kind of interesting. All right. Assume this is your hypothalamus, right here, cell body, and this is your posterior pituitary, right, where the axons are. And then this would be blood vessel. All right? Remember, if you lose fluid from the blood, you have to replace it. Where's that going to come from? Interstitial. If you lose fluid from the interstitial, where does that have to come from? Cell. Okay? As you lose water, what happens to solute concentration? It increases. So things get more concentrated. So as you lose water, concentration increases. All right? What the hell does that have to do with ADH? The cells in the hypothalamus are what we call osmoreceptors. Osmo refers to concentration of something. Okay? So if you have water leaving, blood leaving interstitial, leaving these cells will start to shrink. Right? When water leaves, the cell shrinks. Right? It becomes more concentrated inside the cell. That is the signal to start increasing the number of action potentials down the osmoreceptor and causing the release of ADH into the bloodstream. Right? So as water's leaving the cell, fluid inside of it's getting more concentrated, it's going to be sending more action potentials. All right? Causing the release of ADH. ADH is going to go to the kidneys. It's going to cause you to retain water. And if you retain water, what's going to happen? Fluid goes back into the blood, goes back into the interstitial space, goes back into the osmoreceptor. When the osmoreceptor fills back up, what do you think happens to those action potentials? They shut down. And you don't have the release of ADH anymore. Okay? What if you drink 6 of these a day? How much ADH do you think you're going to detect in your blood? Not much. You're fully hydrated. If you lecture for 4 hours in the morning and then another 2 hours in the afternoon, anatomy, and don't drink any water, what are your ADH levels going to be like? Really high. You're going to be retaining water, and that's why you don't pee throughout the day, because you're trying to retain as much water as possible. All right, so it doesn't cause you to take in more water because you only have so much water in your body. It just causes you to not get rid of the excess because it says you're in a dehydrated state, and if you get rid of any more, you're fucked. If you listen carefully with your stethoscope, right about here, when you're dehydrated, you can actually hear your osmoreceptor saying that. Do you believe that?
You have a headache right
Hmm?
now. Is it because you have a headache right now?
Why?
Ignore me.
Oh yeah, they are talking to me. The voices in my head come from other places. Okay, so what this is showing you is the exact same. This is another way of looking at what I showed you in the previous slide. Here are those osmoreceptors. Here are the axons that go down to the posterior pituitary to release ADH. Here's where they're having their effect in the kidney. If you don't like that, here's a flow diagram to show you the same thing. All right, so I'm not going to go through it again because I like pictures better than I like flow diagrams. But if you're the kind of person that likes those, please use that. A good summary slide to go back to. All right, oxytocin. Setup. Where is it produced? Hypothalamus. Where is it released? Posterior pituitary. Where does it act? The muscle layer of the uterus, contraction, and the smooth muscles surrounding mammary glands, squirting milk out. Okay? So it squirts things out. It squirts out babies, and it squirts out milk. Do what?
It's the squirt.
It's a squirt?
It's the squirt that you're saying is not right.
Does it squirt when it's moist? I know a lot of people have trouble with that word, too.
Scratch my itch my scratch.
Yeah. All right. So, when oxytocin's released, it contracts the muscles of the uterine wall. Again, we talked about that it pushes the baby out. That's a positive feedback. Also causes smooth muscle contraction around the ducts of the mammary system in the breast to help eject milk out. And if you've ever seen a pregnant woman who is like engorged, like you can actually, and these are at work, you can actually see the milk squirting out. It's weird. All right. Just because you guys don't want to hear these things doesn't mean they're not true. All right, the thing about whispering osmoreceptors is not true, but oxytocin is also thought to have neural effects with newborn attachment. All right, so mothers releasing oxytocin that helps them bond with the baby and want to snuggle them. This is probably why, after you went through that traumatic event of pushing this like watermelon out of something the size of a lemon, why you say, "Oh, we should have another one soon," and Dad's like going, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" I told you guys, my wife's the oldest of 8, right? Insane mother-in-law. Feelings of love and closeness. So it's been shown that the more oxytocin you have circulating, the more you tend to have feelings of love and closeness to other people. So people who were born and have gone through like foster system after foster system, they have trouble with attachment. Part of the reason is because they've never developed this oxytocin pathway. All right? and involved in a sexual response. This is like you get done. We're not going to do the sounds associated with that. I already did. Go back to lecture, whatever. And you want to cuddle afterwards. This is the hormone that's responsible for that. Squirt and cuddle.
I did not say that.
Okay. Shoo. It's the end of the day. You are, and I'm not helping. All right. If you have if you have problems with the posterior pituitary, all right, ADH. If we have a decrease in ADH, let's say your hypothalamus isn't producing it, or your posterior pituitary isn't secreting it, that gives us a disease called diabetes insipidus. All right? Different from diabetes mellitus. This has nothing to do with sugar. You guys have probably heard this before, right? What does diabetes mean? To pee a lot, essentially. I mean, that's the rough translated version. What does insipidus mean? What does insipid mean? It lacks taste. What does mellitus mean? It tastes sweet. You know how they used to diagnose diabetes? They tasted the urine. So this is a lot of pee, but it doesn't taste like sugar. And it's because you don't have enough ADH, right? So you're peeing everything out. All right. Contrast, we have syndrome of inappropriate ADH release. That's what SIADH means, syndrome of inappropriate ADH release. So you have too much ADH. If you have too much ADH, you're never doing what? Peeing. Okay, so you're holding on to water, so you're going to be bloated. Things like that. All right. We're not going to go in. There's different types of diabetes insipidus. We're not going to talk about the different types of those, but do know what that means, especially in relation to diabetes mellitus. You guys, as practitioners, should really know that. Oxytocin. If you have problems producing or secreting oxytocin, you probably have feeding problems with your infant. Like if you can't eject milk, they're not going to want to latch on, right? If you can't stimulate the uterus to contract, you're going to have problems pushing that baby out, no matter how much you push. If you have too much oxytocin, what do you think that's going to... If you have too much oxytocin, what's that going to do to the uterus? Really hard contractions. If they happen early enough, spontaneous abortion. If they happen later, you could actually tear a hole in the uterus. Not good. All right. Moving on to, where are we? 43. Thyroid gland, HPT axis. Thyroid gland, we know where it's located. We know what it looks like. What's this cartilage called? Thyroid cartilage. No, that's the cricoid cartilage. Thyroid gland. Do what? Isthmus. All right. If you look at this under a microscope at the thyroid gland, there's two cell types. We have these follicular cells surrounding this colloid, and these are called follicles. Is that thunder? Yes. My pool is not filling. All right, these are going to be responsible for secreting thyroid hormones. Then we have the C cells. C cells are responsible for controlling calcium. So they're going to release calcitonin. All right, so follicular cells release T3, T4. C cells release calcitonin. All right, T3 and T4, the reason why they're called T3 and T4 has to do with the number of iodines on them. Okay, so T3 would have how many iodines? T4? 4. Sweet. All right, so thyroxine is T4. Tri-iodo, 3 iodines. Thyronine is T3. All right, which one is in most abundance? T4. Which one is the stronger hormone? T3. All right, you don't want a super strong hormone in high abundance. You're going to rupture your uterus. That has nothing to do with thyroid hormone. That's just an example of too much of something. All right. Why T3, T4? What are they important? Well, what they do, they increase the basal BMR, basal metabolic rate of cells. So they put cells into a state of more active being. That means they're going to metabolize things quicker. They're going to cause things to grow faster. They're going to cause things to divide faster. All right? They are absolutely essential for growth and development of the nervous system. If you have a mother that is hypothyroid and is not taking care of it, their baby's probably going to be born with some neural defects. Is that always going to happen? No. But there's a much greater likelihood. Okay? It's like if your mom smoked when you were pregnant. Are you guaranteed to be low birth weight or any problems? No, but there's a higher likelihood of it. All right. If you don't have iodine, you don't have thyroid hormones. Okay, so iodine has to be there in order for thyroid hormones to work. Anybody know what happens if you don't have iodine and you don't have thyroid hormones? A goiter, big thing around your neck, so your thyroid gland enlarges, and you have this big goiter on your neck. Okay. Anybody know why that is? So, HPT axis. TRH causes release of TSH, which causes release of T3, T4. T3 and T4 go back and shut these off, right? If you're not producing T3 and T4, you have nothing to go shut these off, TSH is going to continue to stimulate the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is going to grow and grow and grow. Why? Because that's its response. It's saying, all right, we got to produce more of this stuff, but we don't have it to produce, so we got to get bigger. That's how our body operates. Like, we can't produce it, so let's do more stuff. Okay, and that's where the goiter comes from. All right. Let's not get into thyroid hormone production. The only thing I want to say is that you take in iodine to these follicular cells, they get put onto T3, they get put onto tyrosine, and then that tyrosine all right, back up. T3 and T4 are what? They're based off tyrosine. What's tyrosine? An amino acid. So what happens is this iodine gets put onto tyrosines. These tyrosines get put into proteins, and these proteins get stored in the colloid. When you want to release T3 and T4, you basically take tyrosines off of the protein and put them into a secretion pathway. Okay? So they're stored as proteins. You take that off, and then you put them in a secretion pathway. That's basically what that is saying. All right. So, again, here are your questions. T3, T4. Where's it produced? The thyroid follicles, the follicular cells, stored in the colloid. Where does it act? Peripheral tissues. So any tissue of the body could be a potential target. So that means every tissue in your body has a receptor for it. What's its structure? It's tyrosine derived, so it is an amino acid. In this case, does that mean it's water soluble? No, it is lipid soluble. So its receptor is located inside of cells. Okay? Once these hormones get to the cells, much of your T4 is converted to T3 just by removing an iodine. All right? And again, which one is the more potent? T3. All right? So it converts it to the more potent form once it gets to the cells. All right? There's something called reverse T3 also. And this is can be used as a diagnostic marker. We're not going to go into that. Maybe you'll talk about it when you get to endocrine in your clin med classes. But it's basically putting the iodine on a different part of the molecule, T3. So if it's over here, it's putting it over here. That's what reverse T3 is. Still works. All right. Since they're lipid soluble, are they going to be transported freely in the blood? No. They have to be transported by plasma proteins. Most of them are bound to thyroxine binding globulin. All right. Most of them are bound to this protein. They can bind to albumin or prealbumin, but most of it's this protein. All right. Again, if they're lipid soluble, they go right through the cell membrane. They make it into the nucleus. They act as a transcription factor. They produce more what? mRNA. That goes out, produce more protein, and that's what's going to drive the increase in metabolism, producing more metabolic proteins. And where would a lot of these metabolic proteins go? If you're more active and you're using more energy, they need to go to what part of the cell? Mitochondria. Not what cell, what part of a cell. So the mitochondria to produce energy. Okay? Negative feedback, same way you'd have any other negative feedback. If you are low in T3 and T4, hypothalamus is going to release TRH. It's going to tell the anterior pituitary to release TSH. That's going to tell the thyroids to release T3, T4. All right? Those are going to go to cells. What's this? Mitochondria. Tell them to produce more energy. When T3 and T4 levels get to high enough levels, they'll go back and shut off that pathway. All right? And then what's going to happen to T3 and T4 levels over time? Drop, 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 drop. Then the pathway will be stimulated again. Okay? So that's how the negative feedback works. All right.